Okay, in this video I want to try and cut back to some of the earlier material that I was talking about. And I was talking about embodied cognition and the way that the sensory motor system evolved to process the interactions of an evolving organism with the natural environment, and then I sort of jumped over some stuff to move towards talking about metaphors. And I think there's one or two bits, a few gaps really that I need to fill in. So I'm just working on one of those gaps right now. So let's just see how far I can get with this. Okay, I'll be reading this again, so apologies if it's a little bit... I shouldn't keep apologising all the time, I'll just do it. Okay, David Hubel I'm talking about here. David Hubel, in the book Eye, Brain and Vision, remarks that the brain is a machine that, he says, does tasks in a way that is consonant with the laws of physics, an object that we can understand in the same way that we understand a printing press. Now in this, Hubel is clearly making a plea for an approach to brain science which corresponds to physical naturalism, and for the avoidance of any metaphysical or supernatural interpretations. And whilst I completely support this ambition, I think it's likely that the functioning of the brain involves processes which require forms of understanding that are radically different from those we use to understand the mechanical objects of the material world. It's not to say they're not natural, they're just understood in a way which is different. A printing press, as Richard Dawkins might put it, is a middle-sized object moving at middle speed. The workings of a printing press are entirely explicable in terms of Newtonian physics and basic mechanics, or at least those workings which are significant to its major functions at any rate. A brain, on the other hand, utilises electrochemical and biochemical, and possibly even quantum mechanical processes, if the work by Hameroff and Penrose is anything to go by, for example, possibly quantum mechanical processes, which are completely beyond the reach of Newtonian physics, and which can only be approached using very different mathematical and scientific models. This distinction is significant because, as middle-sized objects ourselves, we can apparently think and talk about processes which operate on the Newtonian scale literally and directly. I say apparently because I'm going to come back to that in a little while. But when we think and talk about processes which lie outside of that scale, we enter a world outside direct experience which we can only address metaphorically, using the ultimately metaphorical constructions of mathematics. The case for mathematics as essentially metaphorical has been argued robustly by Rafael Nunez and George Lakoff in a number of excellent books, and I'll put the references to those on the end of this piece. This means that whilst we might one day fully understand the brain, we will never understand it in the same way that we understand the printing press. This is something that brain science has in common with quantum physics. As I mentioned at the beginning of this blog, the mathematician J.B.S. Haldane famously observed that the universe may not only be queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. He intended this observation to apply specifically to the more esoteric aspects of the universe encountered mainly by astronomers and particle physicists, whose equations do indeed describe a world which is inconceivable in any literal sense, and which makes no intuitive appeal to the senses of even the most highly trained. As Richard Feynman is reputed to have said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't understand quantum mechanics. This observation could just as easily be applied to the mechanism and matter of the brain. So to return to Hubel's comment about the brain and the printing press, it could be argued that since we have the minds of middle-sized objects built out of the need to solve the problems facing middle-sized objects, those minds are themselves, in a sense, middle-sized. Joseph McIntyre and others at the European Laboratory for the Neurosciences of Action have shown that minds intuitively understand something approximating Newtonian physics. There is therefore a grain of truth in what Hubel says, although it is more appropriately aimed at the mind and the processes of understanding and conceptualization, not the physical brain. So the mind can be understood in the same way that we understand a printing press. An understanding of a complex entity like the human brain, the working of which is fundamentally abstract, can only be achieved through the use of analogy, metaphor and symbol, including mathematical symbols. And what goes for the conceptualization of the brain is also the case with most other empirical scientific data and theories. Like all abstract objects of knowledge, these empirical facts, falsifiable, robust, and independently arrived at, are ultimately poetic tropes. In a book called Man a Machine from 1928, Joseph Needham wrote that mechanism and materialism lie at the foundation of scientific thought. It's usually assumed that by this he meant that all science is ultimately mechanical and grossly materialistic, an archaic and vaguely quaint notion. However, it's possible that what he meant was that while the phenomena of the universe may be wildly exotic and far beyond the reach of the human senses, and of any mechanistic or materialistic explanation constructed only from the evidence of those senses, there is nevertheless a place for this kind of thinking in even the most esoteric and counterintuitive of scientific theories. A more positive reading of Needham's comment may point us toward the recognition that all of our theorization and conceptualization is ultimately grounded in thinking which is human scale and locked into the wonders of the mechanism and of matter. Does this necessarily mean, therefore, that the world of human being is divided into two regions, the concrete and objective world of the senses, and this other abstract world that is forever beyond the reach of hand and eye? Do we experience, along with our primate ancestors, some parts of the world neat and unmediated, the solidly factual trees and rocks, and then as human beings have this other layer of reality that is equally factual but materially unavailable without the extrasensory metaphors of modern physics? Is there really a fault line in the universe separating that which appears on the radar of human senses and is expressible in plain language from that which makes no sensory contact and can only be communicated through the poetry of mathematics? What I'm going to want to talk about in the next video is obviously not. There is no such fault line. But that's pretty much all I want to get up to now. So thanks very much again for your patience in watching.